The notebook landed in a trash can in front of 200 people, and the man who wrote it didn't move. Margaret Holt hadn't even looked at the cover. She had lifted it off the conference table with 2 fingers, the way a person removes something left behind by a stranger, and dropped it without breaking her sentence. The room laughed. Not all of it, but enough. Daniel Mercer stood at the back of that room in a drugstore name badge and a jacket that had been dry cleaned one too many times. He watched the can. He didn't reach for it. He didn't look at the floor. He looked at her. Just once. The way a man looks at a weather system he has already calculated. The notebook held 14 formulas. One of them had taken him 6 years. One of them solved a problem Margaret Holt's own research division had spent 11 years and $40 million failing to crack. She would learn that. The whole room would learn that. But first, she would finish her sentence, and the room would finish laughing, and Daniel Mercer would pick up the notebook on his way out, quietly, without hurry, and take it home to his daughter. The alarm went off at 6:15, and Daniel was already awake. He had been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table, with the notebook open and a cup of coffee going cold beside it. The overhead light was off. He worked by the small lamp on the counter, the one Ellie had picked out herself at a garage sale 2 summers ago, the one with the yellow shade that made everything in the kitchen look like late afternoon, even at dawn. He said it hurt his eyes. He had never replaced it. The notebook was not pretty. The cover was black cardboard, the kind that costs 89 cents at a drugstore, which was appropriate, because that was exactly where he had bought it. The spine was cracked and retaped with a strip of clear packing tape that had since gone yellow. Coffee rings layered the front cover like tree rings. Each one a different morning, a different calculation, a different dead end rerouted. Inside, the pages were dense, not messy, dense. The handwriting was small and perfectly even, the kind of handwriting that comes not from patience, but from years of writing in margins, where there was no room to be careless. Molecular structures, delivery ratios, solubility curves annotated in 2 colors of ink, black for the formula, red for the correction, 14 sections, each separated by a strip of torn notebook paper used as a tab, each tab labeled in the same small hand. He had started it the year after Claire died, not because he had planned to. He hadn't planned anything that year. He had moved Ellie from Zurich to his mother's house in Dayton, taken the first job that didn't require him to think too hard, and spent 8 months learning how not to come apart in front of a child who was watching him constantly, for signs of what came next. The notebook had started as something to do with his hands, at 2 in the morning, when sleep stopped working. A problem he already knew. Familiar territory. Something that asked nothing of him emotionally, and everything of him technically, which was the only trade he was willing to make that year. The problem was bioavailability. Specifically, the failure rate of oral protein-based drug delivery, the reason entire classes of medication had to be injected rather than swallowed, the reason patients sat in clinic chairs 3 times a week when they could have been home. It was not a new problem. It was an old problem that the industry had decided was probably unsolvable and had filed accordingly. Daniel had worked adjacent to it for 6 years in Zurich, watched 4 different research teams approach it and turn back, and had his own private theory about why every approach had failed. The theory required starting over from a completely different assumption. He had never had the time or the reason to pursue it. After Claire died, he had both. He closed the notebook at 6:40 when he heard the sound of small feet on the hallway floor, the specific sound of socked feet trying to be quiet and failing, the shuffle drag of someone who was not yet fully awake, but had decided to be present anyway. Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, one hand holding the door frame, the other holding Biscuit, a stuffed bear so old and reloved that his original brown had faded to something closer to cream, his left ear restitched twice, in different colors of thread, because Ellie had been particular about the repairs being visible. She said it meant Biscuit had stories. She looked at the notebook on the table, She looked at her father. "You were up," she said. It was not a question. "I was up," he said. She climbed into the chair across from him and set Biscuit on the table facing outward, the way she always did, so he could see the room. Then she pulled her breakfast plate toward her. Daniel had set it out before she woke. Half a waffle, 4 strawberry slices, a small pile of blueberries. He watched her arrange them. The strawberries went to the left edge of the plate, touching nothing. The blueberries moved to the right, a careful distance from the waffle. She rotated the plate slightly, checked the geometry of it, and then picked up her fork. "Today's the conference," she said. "It is. Are you nervous?" He considered the question the way he considered most of her questions, fully, without talking down to it. "No," he said. She looked at him over her fork. "Biscuit thinks you should wear the blue tie. Tell Biscuit I'll consider it." She ate. He drank his coffee. The yellow lamp made the kitchen glow. The conference was not something Daniel had sought. He had not submitted a paper or requested a speaking slot. What had happened was simpler and stranger than that. A junior acquisitions analyst at Holt Biosynth named Peter Garza had been sent to a regional pharmacists networking event 3 months earlier to hand out branded pens and collect business cards, and had ended up in a conversation with Daniel that lasted 2 hours and ended with Peter photographing 4 pages of the notebook with his phone and emailing them to his supervisor at 11 o'clock that night, with a subject line that read, "You need to see this." What followed was a series of exchanges that Daniel had approached with the same quiet carefulness he applied to everything, answering questions precisely, volunteering nothing extra, declining to send the full notebook digitally. He had agreed to attend the quarterly innovation conference as a guest presenter. 15 minutes. He had prepared accordingly. He wore the blue tie. The drugstore where he worked was called Harmon's. It had been on the same corner for 31 years and smelled of floor wax and the particular sweetness of old cardboard. Daniel had worked there for 4 years. His name badge said Daniel, Pharmacy. His colleagues knew he was precise and reliable, and occasionally looked at the pill compounds with an expression they couldn't quite name. None of them had asked about it. He had not explained. He drove to Columbus in a 6-year-old Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a daughter who fell asleep 20 minutes outside of Dayton with Biscuit against the window and her breakfast plate, which she had insisted on bringing, balanced carefully on her lap. Nothing touching. He parked. He looked at the conference center. He looked at the notebook on the passenger seat. He picked it up, got out of the car, and went inside. The conference center smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition. It was the kind of building that had been designed to impress people who were already impressed with themselves. High ceilings, glass partitions, a lobby waterfall that no one looked at. Registration tables lined the entrance, staffed by young people in lanyards who handed out branded tote bags and checked names against tablets with the focused energy of people performing competence. Daniel gave his name. The young man scrolled again, found it near the bottom of a supplementary list, and printed a badge that said, "Guest Presenter," in smaller font than everyone else's. He found Ellie, a seat in a side alcove off the main hall, a quiet space, with low chairs and a charging station, and a courtesy table with juice boxes and packaged cookies. She approved of it. She set Biscuit on the armrest facing outward, arranged her breakfast plate on her knees. She had eaten nothing from it in the car, saving it, and he had learned not to question the logic of this, and opened the small backpack she'd packed herself, which contained 3 crayons, a library book about ocean animals, and a travel-sized hand sanitizer she had included for reasons she had not shared. "I'll be in the big room," Daniel said. "I know." She was already reading. "If you need me, Dad." She looked up. "Go do the thing." He went to do the thing. The main conference hall held 200 seats, arranged in shallow theater rows, facing a stage with a podium and a screen. By the time Daniel arrived, it was nearly full. Pharmaceutical executives, research directors, licensing attorneys, acquisition leads. People who wore their credentials the way other people wore jewelry, visibly and with intention. Daniel took a position near the back wall. He did not look for a seat. He had learned, a long time ago, that standing near the back of a room gave you a clearer view of how it actually worked. Margaret Holt was not hard to identify. She was at the center of a constellation of people near the stage, not the largest group in the room, but the one with the most deliberate orbit. People approached her, said what they needed to say, and moved away with the satisfied efficiency of a task completed. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, dressed in a way that communicated expense without trying to. She had built Holt Biosynth from a regional generics manufacturer into a mid-size innovator, with 4 drugs in late-stage trials, and a reputation for acquiring small breakthroughs before the larger firms noticed them. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful person in the room. She had not looked in Daniel's direction. The first 2 presentations ran long. A research director from a university partnership presented data on targeted delivery mechanisms that the room received politely, but without heat. A licensing executive from a competing firm walked through a portfolio of acquired compounds with the enthusiasm of a man reading a bus schedule. The room was attentive in the way conference rooms are attentive, present, caffeinated, and quietly waiting for something worth the trip. Daniel was called third. He walked to the front of the room with the notebook under his arm. No laptop, no slide deck. He had been told there would be a projector available and had declined the offer to use it. The moderator introduced him in 7 words. Daniel Mercer, independent researcher, guest presenter, Columbus area. There was no applause, just the quiet repositioning of 200 people, deciding how much attention to allocate to someone with no institutional affiliation and a composition notebook. He set the notebook on the podium and opened it to the first tabbed section. He had not prepared remarks in the traditional sense. He had prepared a problem statement, a methodology summary, and 3 data sets that he could walk through in 12 minutes, leaving 3 for questions. He began with the problem, the bioavailability failure rate, the 11-year industry stall, the 4 major approaches that had each collapsed at the same structural point. He spoke without notes. He drew a molecular diagram freehand on the whiteboard beside the podium in under 40 seconds, labeled it, and turned back to the room. The room was slightly more attentive than it had been 30 seconds earlier. He moved to the methodology. This was where the notebook became necessary, not as a prop, but as a working document. He referenced specific pages, specific ratios, specific correction sequences. He did not explain the notebook's existence or history. He used it the way a carpenter uses a measuring tape, as a tool, unremarkably, because it was the right tool for the task. He was 4 minutes in when Margaret Holt's attention shifted. He saw it happen, not because she announced it, but because the people around her noticed it and adjusted. The quiet recalibration of a room when the person who matters most in it changes the direction of their focus. She had been half-turned in her seat, one hand on her phone. The phone went face down on the armrest. She straightened slightly. She looked at the whiteboard. He continued. He reached the 3rd data set, the one that addressed the structural failure point directly, the one that showed, in 4 columns of figures and 1 annotated curve, why every previous approach had collapsed, and what the corrected delivery sequence produced instead. He read the result number aloud, once, without emphasis. The room went a particular kind of quiet that had nothing to do with politeness. He closed the notebook and looked up. "That's the summary," he said. "I have 3 minutes if there are questions." There were no questions, not immediately. The silence ran 4 full seconds, which in a conference room is geological. Then a research director in the 3rd row raised her hand and asked him to repeat the bioavailability percentage from the 3rd data set. He repeated it. She wrote it down. 2 other people wrote it down, without having asked. It was at this point that Margaret Holt stood up. She did not raise her hand. She walked to the front of the room with the practiced authority of someone who had decided the normal protocols did not apply to her, which, in this room, was probably correct. She stopped at the edge of the stage area, looked at the notebook, and then looked at Daniel in his dry-cleaned jacket and his drugstore name badge and his blue tie. "Where did this come from?" she said. Not hostile. Yet. Assessing. "I wrote it," Daniel said. She looked at the notebook again. Then, with the particular confidence of a person who has been right so many times that the possibility of being wrong has stopped feeling real, she reached out, lifted the notebook from the podium with 2 fingers, and turned it over once, examining it the way an appraiser examines something they have already decided is not worth their time. The cracked spine, the taped binding, the coffee rings. She set it down on the edge of the conference table. Then she picked it up again and dropped it into the trash can beside the table. "Someone threw away their grocery list," she said to the room, already half turned back toward her seat. "And you brought it to my conference." The room laughed. "Not all of it, but enough." Daniel stood at the podium. He did not reach for the can. He did not look at the floor. He looked at her. Once, briefly, the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. And then he thanked the moderator, stepped down from the stage, and walked back to the alcove where his daughter was reading about ocean animals. He sat down beside her. She looked at his face. Children read faces, the way adults read headlines, quickly, for the essential information. "Did it go okay?" she said. He reached over and straightened Biscuit, who had tilted slightly on the armrest. "It went fine," he said. She looked at him one more second, decided to believe him, and went back to her book. He sat with his hands in his lap and waited for the thing he knew was coming. Peter Garza found him in the alcove 17 minutes later. He was slightly out of breath, which meant he had been moving quickly through the building, which meant something had shifted in the room after Daniel left it. Daniel had expected this. He had not expected it to be quite this fast. Peter was 26, earnest in the way that people are earnest before institutions finish teaching them not to be. He had a lanyard with 3 badge attachments and the expression of a man carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver. He stopped at the edge of the alcove, looked at Ellie, who looked back at him with the calm, evaluating gaze of a child who has learned to read strangers quickly, and then looked at Daniel. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "Dr. Vasquez wants to speak with you." Daniel looked at him. "Who is Dr. Vasquez?" "She's—" Peter steadied himself. "She's our head of research." She was in the 3rd row. "She's the one who asked you to repeat the number." Daniel nodded once. He looked at Ellie. "I have to go back in for a few minutes," he said. Ellie was already reaching into her backpack. She produced the 3rd crayon, the blue one, and held it out to him without looking up from her book. "For luck," she said. He took it. He put it in his jacket pocket. He followed Peter Garza back into the conference hall. The hall had reorganized itself. The formal session had broken for a networking interval, which in practice meant that the room had rearranged into clusters of urgent conversation. Daniel noticed 3 things as he entered. First, the trash can had been moved. It was now against the far wall, away from the stage, as though someone had wanted it out of the immediate sightline. Second, the whiteboard had not been erased. His molecular diagram was still there, and 2 people were standing in front of it with their phones raised. Third, Margaret Holt was on the far side of the room in a conversation that, from the body language of everyone involved, had stopped being casual some time ago. Dr. Vasquez was waiting near the whiteboard. She was in her mid-40s, compact and precise, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a tablet in one hand. She had the particular stillness of a scientist who has learned to be very careful about showing excitement before the data justifies it. She looked at Daniel as he approached and did not extend her hand immediately. She looked at him the way she had looked at the whiteboard, with the same focused, calculating attention. "Your 3rd data set," she said. No greeting. "The corrected delivery sequence. Walk me through the underlying assumption." Daniel walked her through it. He spoke for 8 minutes. He did not use the whiteboard this time. He used the notebook, which he had retrieved from the trash can on his way out of the hall earlier, sliding it out without ceremony, tucking it under his arm, and continuing to the alcove without looking back. The notebook was open now, on the table between them. Dr. Vasquez looked at the pages, the way a person looks at something they recognize but cannot immediately place, the particular disorientation of encountering a solution to a problem you have been living inside for so long that solutions have started to feel theoretical. She stopped him at the correction sequence on page 47. "This adjustment," she said, pointing to a red annotation in the margin. "This is where the previous models failed, every one of them." She looked up. "How did you know to correct here?" "Because every previous model started from the same wrong assumption," Daniel said. "They were trying to protect the compound during gastric transit. I started from the opposite position. Accelerate the transit. Change the absorption window instead." She was quiet for 4 seconds. "We tried transit acceleration in 2019, she said carefully. "It degraded the compound." "At the standard molecular weight, yes," Daniel said. He turned to page 51. "I reduced the molecular weight at the carrier level first. The degradation doesn't occur below this threshold." He pointed to a figure. She leaned in. Her reading glasses came down from her head. She read the page. She read the next page. She turned back to page 47 and read it again. The junior technician who had been hovering at the edge of their conversation, a young woman with a clipboard who had clearly been sent to observe and report back, lowered her clipboard slowly and forgot to raise it again. An older man in a charcoal suit who had drifted into proximity, apparently checking his phone, had stopped checking his phone. Dr. Vasquez looked up from the notebook. She looked at Daniel's name badge. "Daniel, pharmacy." She looked at his jacket. She looked at his face. "Where did you train?" she said. "ETH Zurich," Daniel said. "And 6 years in formulation at Kern Molecular. I led the protein delivery division from 2013 to 2019. The name landed in the air between them. The man in the charcoal suit looked up from his phone. Kern Molecular was not a household name outside the industry. Inside the industry, it was something else entirely. A Swiss firm with a 40-year record of foundational pharmaceutical research. The kind of institution whose alumni carried a specific weight. The kind of place that did not hire people to lead divisions lightly or young. The man in the charcoal suit opened his mouth, closed it, and took a half-step closer. Dr. Vasquez set down her tablet. "You led the protein delivery division at Kern," she said. It was not quite a question. "Until 2019, Daniel said. She absorbed this. She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. And then something in her posture changed. A small, precise adjustment. The kind that happens not from decision, but from recalculation, when a person realizes they have been operating with the wrong information, and the correct information is significantly larger. "I need to make a call," she said quietly. "To no one in particular." She stepped away from the table. The man in the charcoal suit moved toward Daniel, with his hand extended. The young woman with the clipboard looked down at it, and then back up, as though checking whether the clipboard contained a procedure for this situation, and finding that it did not. Daniel stood at the table with his notebook open in front of him. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the blue crayon. He did not look toward Margaret Holt's side of the room. He did not need to. He could tell, from the way the room was reorganizing itself, slowly, in the way of rooms that are recalibrating around a new center of gravity, that the information was traveling. These things always traveled. He had watched it happen before, in other rooms, in other cities. When a result came back that changed the shape of a problem everyone had agreed was one shape. He closed the notebook. He straightened his tie. Across the room, near the windows, he could see Peter Garza speaking quietly to Margaret Holt. Her back was to Daniel. He watched Peter say something. He watched her go still. Not the stillness of a person who has heard nothing, but the stillness of a person who has heard something they need a moment to process. She did not turn around. Not yet. Daniel picked up the notebook, nodded to the man in the charcoal suit, and went back to the alcove. Ellie was on the last chapter of the ocean animal book. "That was more than a few minutes," she said. "It was," he said. He sat down beside her and handed back the blue crayon. She examined it, decided it had been returned in acceptable condition, and put it back in her backpack. "Biscuit says something happened," she said. Daniel looked at the bear, propped on the armrest, facing the room. "Tell Biscuit he's perceptive," he said. She nodded seriously, as though filing this away for later transmission. They drove home in the early evening. Ellie fell asleep before they reached the highway, one hand curled around Biscuit, the breakfast plate finally empty on the floor beneath her feet. She had eaten everything on the drive out of Columbus, methodically, strawberries first, in the way she did everything. Daniel drove with the radio off. The flat Ohio landscape moved past the windows in long, darkening strips of field and tree line, and the occasional cluster of lights from a gas station or a grain elevator, and he let the road do what roads do when a person needs to think without thinking. His phone had rung twice before he reached the car. He had not answered. He got Ellie inside, got her teeth brushed, got Biscuit situated on the pillow in the specific position Ellie required, on his side, facing the door, which she said was so he could watch for things, though she had never specified what things, and sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed and deepened, and her hand relaxed against the blanket. He went downstairs. The kitchen was the way he had left it that morning. Lamp on, the yellow light making everything look like late afternoon. He put the kettle on without wanting tea, the way a person reaches for a familiar action when the unfamiliar is too large to look at directly. He sat at the table. He set the notebook in front of him. He did not open it. There was a bill on the corner of the table. There was always a bill on the corner of the table. This one was from the furnace company, the annual service they had done in October, which he had been paying in installments because the October billing cycle had landed in the same week as Ellie's school supply list and the copay for her eye appointment and the replacement of 2 tires that had not been optional. He had been making the installments reliably. He had 3 remaining. He looked at the bill. He looked at the notebook. He had known what was in the notebook for 4 years. He had known its value, not sentimentally, not approximately, but precisely, in the way a person knows the value of something they built from first principles with their own hands. He had not pursued it. This was not passivity. It was a calculation he had made clearly and revisited periodically, the way he revisited all calculations. Ellie was 8. She needed consistency more than she needed a father who was fighting for something. She needed dinner at the same time, and Biscuit on the correct side of the pillow, and someone who came home from a job that ended at a predictable hour. He had given her that. He had been deliberate about giving her that. What he had not calculated for was the conference. Peter Garza's invitation had seemed small when it arrived. 15 minutes, a guest slot, the chance to put the work in front of people who might understand it. He had told himself it was just a presentation. He had believed that when he told it to himself, which was the thing that troubled him now, sitting at the kitchen table in the yellow light, he had believed it because it was easier than believing what it actually was, a door, and the question of whether he was prepared to walk through it, and everything that walking through it would change. He picked up a pen. He opened the notebook to the inside back cover. The equation was there, where it had always been. Claire's handwriting, looser than his, slightly larger, the kind of handwriting that moved quickly, because the mind behind it moved quickly. She had written it on a Tuesday evening in their apartment in Zurich, sitting across from him at a table not unlike this one, working through a problem she had encountered in her own research, and had handed the notebook to him and said, "Start from here instead." He had looked at it. He had understood immediately what she meant and where it led. He had told her so. She had died 14 months later. He had started the notebook 6 months after that. He sat with the pen in his hand and did not write anything. He looked at her equation. He looked at the lamp. Through the ceiling he could hear nothing. Ellie was fully asleep, the house fully quiet, the kind of quiet that accumulates in small houses after children go to bed and sits in the rooms like a presence. He thought about Margaret Holt, dropping the notebook into the trash can. He thought about Dr. Vasquez reading page 47. He thought about the phone ringing twice on the way to the car. He put the pen down. He closed the notebook carefully, the way he always closed it, pressing the cover flat, running his thumb along the spine. He stood up. He turned off the kettle. He went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Ellie's room for a moment, long enough to hear her breathing, long enough to see that Biscuit had not moved from his position facing the door. He went back downstairs. He sat at the table. He picked up his phone and listened to the messages. Then he opened the notebook again, not to Claire's equation this time, but to page 1, and began to read from the beginning, the way a person reads something they are about to hand to the world and will not be able to take back. He read until 2 in the morning. The lamp stayed on. The authentication meeting was held 6 weeks later, in a building in Chicago that had the specific gravity of a place where large numbers are discussed in quiet voices. It was a law firm, 43rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake, a conference table long enough to seat 16, which it did, licensing attorneys, research directors, 2 independent pharmaceutical consultants retained to verify the formulas, a representative from the patent office, Peter Garza, near the end of the table, with a legal pad and the expression of a person who had not fully slept in 6 weeks. Dr. Vasquez, across from him, with the notebook, now encased in a clear archival sleeve, open in front of her to page 47. Daniel sat at one end of the table, in a suit he had not owned 6 weeks ago. Ellie sat beside him, in a chair slightly too large for her, with Biscuit on her lap, and a library book in her bag that she was trying not to reach for, because Daniel had asked her to wait. She was waiting. It was costing her something, which she expressed by sitting extremely straight. The lead consultant spoke first. His name was Dr. Harold Fitch, 60 years in pharmaceutical research, former head of formulation at 2 of the largest firms in the world. The kind of man whose opinion in this room was not one input among several, but the thing the room had assembled to hear. He had spent 3 weeks with the notebook. He had submitted a written assessment that had been distributed to everyone present that morning. He had asked to deliver a verbal summary in addition. He looked at his notes. He looked at the notebook in its archival sleeve. He looked at Daniel. "In 40 years," he said, "I have been asked to assess 3 discoveries I would describe as genuinely foundational. Not incremental, not competitive, foundational, the kind of work that changes the starting point for everyone who comes after." He paused. He was not a man who paused for effect. He paused because he was being precise. "This is the 4th. The room was silent. He continued. "The bioavailability correction," he said, "was not merely viable. It was elegant, which in science is a specific and serious word, meaning that the solution was arrived at from a direction no one else had considered, and that its correctness was, once seen, almost obvious. The carrier-level molecular weight reduction was, in his assessment, something that would have been discovered eventually. But eventually, in this field, meant a decade, perhaps 2. The delivery sequence adjustment was original, to the point where he had checked it 4 times before accepting that it was both new and correct. The remaining 13 formulas ranged, in his assessment, from significantly valuable to the kind of thing that licensing departments would be discussing for the next 30 years. He closed his notes. "The question before this room is not whether the work has value," he said. "The value is not in question. The question is what the work is worth." The number that emerged from the next 2 hours of discussion was not a single figure, but a structure. An upfront licensing payment, a royalty arrangement, milestone payments tied to clinical outcomes. The attorneys built it carefully, the way attorneys build things that need to hold weight. Daniel sat at the end of the table and listened and answered questions when questions were put to him, which was less often than might be expected, because the work answered most of the questions itself. The final number, up front, against projected milestone totals, was $340 million. It was stated by the lead attorney in the same tone she might use to read a street address. She moved immediately to the next item. The room moved with her. Ellie, who had been sitting straight for 2 hours, leaned toward her father and whispered, "What was that number?" He wrote it on the corner of her library book cover. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked at it again. "Is that good?" she said, very quietly. He nodded once. She sat back. She thought about it for a moment. Then she put Biscuit on the table, facing the room, so he could see, underscore. It was near the end of the meeting, during a brief recess, that Margaret Holt appeared. She had not been on the attendee list. She came in through the side door, without her team, without her attorney, in a coat she had not taken off, the posture of a person who had decided to do something and arrived before they could decide otherwise. She crossed the room to where Daniel stood by the windows. She stopped in front of him. She was not diminished. She was not performing remorse. She was a woman who had built something real and was standing in front of a mistake of equivalent scale, and she was looking at it directly, which was, Daniel understood, not nothing. "I didn't read it," she said. "No," he said. "I should have read it." He looked at her for a moment. Outside, the lake was flat and gray and enormous. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. She extended her hand. He shook it. No speech, no performance. Just two people in a room where the accounting had been completed, and the result was clear. She left through the side door. He stood at the window for a moment. Then he went back to the table, sat down beside his daughter, and straightened Biscuit, who had tilted slightly toward the window. Across the table, Dr. Vasquez caught his eye. She did not smile, she nodded, once, with the specific gravity of a scientist acknowledging a result that had taken longer than it should have to be seen. In the attendee copy of the licensing agreement, in the provenance section on the 3rd page, the line read, "Formulas 1 to 14, Daniel James Mercer. Original author, sole inventor, his name, in the document. Permanent. He was home before dinner." This was the thing Ellie noticed first, not the suit, not the fact that he had been quiet in the car, in a different way than usual, not even the small wrapped package he had carried in from the passenger seat. She noticed that he was home before dinner, which had not happened on a weekday in longer than she could specifically remember, and she registered this the way children register the alteration of reliable things. Carefully, with her full attention. He made pasta, not anything elaborate, the kind with butter and Parmesan and a little black pepper, the kind he had made on the first night in this house, when the boxes were still unpacked, and Ellie had sat on the kitchen floor with Biscuit and declared that it was the best pasta she had ever eaten, which it was not, but which he had chosen to believe. He made it the same way now, same pot, same amount of butter, which was more than was probably advisable. Ellie sat at the table and reported to Biscuit, in a low, ongoing commentary, the specific events of the day in Chicago, including the number, which she had memorized from the corner of her library book, and recited to Biscuit with the careful pronunciation of someone who has recently learned a very large word. Daniel set the bowl in front of her. He sat down across from her. The yellow lamp was on. The kitchen smelled like butter and Parmesan, and the faint, particular smell of a house that two people have lived in long enough to make it specifically theirs. The notebook was on the counter behind him, not displayed, not opened, set down the way a person sets down something they have been carrying for a long time and have finally put in the right place. Ellie ate for a moment. She turned something over in her mind. He could see it happening. The small internal negotiation of a child, deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking. She said it. "Dad," she said, "did Mama know what was in the book?" He looked at her. He looked at the notebook on the counter. He thought about Claire at the table in Zurich, in the apartment with the tall windows and the view of the courtyard, handing him the notebook with her equation on the inside back cover and saying, "Start from here instead." He thought about the way she had said it, not like a suggestion, like a direction, like someone who could already see where it led. He looked back at his daughter. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He reached over and straightened Biscuit on the armrest of the empty chair, set him facing outward so he could see the room, and then he got up, crossed to the counter, and turned off the lamp. The kitchen went quiet and dark and warm. Some debts the world owes are paid slowly. In rooms the person who earned them never expected to enter.